Welcome to the Podcast Digest, the podcast dedicated to helping you find the best shows worthy of your subscription, as well as conversations with their creators. And now, your host, Dan Lizette.
Yes, indeed. Welcome back to the Podcast Digest. So, if you've been a listener to the Podcast Digest for a while, you know I'm a huge fan of technology podcasts with my recommendations like Clockwise and the Notco's Almanac in the past, but also of storytelling shows, like when I've recommended Criminal and Snap Judgment. Well, believe it or not, there is one guy out there attempting to combine the best of both of these worlds, and to my knowledge, for the first time. This show is called Inquisitive from Relay FM, and I'm super excited and humbled to be joined by the host of the show and co-founder of Relay FM, Myke Hurley. Myke, welcome to the Podcast Digest.
Dan, thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be joined by you today. It really means a lot to me. And I had you on today because I really wanted to talk to you and let my listeners know about what you're doing with Inquisitive. For anyone that's not yet familiar, can you tell them about the show and kind of how you came up with this idea?
So, kind of for the last 5 years, I've been doing a weekly show on a Wednesday, and for maybe 4.5 years of that time, it's been interview-based. So I have a guest on and do a 45-minute interview. And basically, I've had a couple of different shows under different names, but they've been relatively similar. When we started Relay FM in August, I started a new show with that kind of idea, that format called Inquisitive, but my idea was always that at some point I would find a new spin for the show, and we've been playing around with a couple of ideas, and we landed on a series idea, and the first series is called Behind the App. And what I'm doing is I've been working for the last few months on interviewing a bunch of really interesting independent app developers that I know, some friends, and some as the series goes on and widening the net a little bit more to talking to different people. And I'm talking to them about the history of iOS app development, but also what it's like to be an independent app developer today. And as the time's gone on, what I'm trying to do is to create something which is more documentary-like in its purpose, and make something that is listenable in a couple of years. So you can listen to it now and hear what the current state is, but maybe you listen back in a year's time, 2 years' time, and you get a real snapshot as to what it was like in 2015 being an iOS app developer. And it's a lot of work, but it's a project that I'm really proud of, and I think that we're doing some interesting stuff with it right now.
So you've talked about in some of your other shows, like Analog for one, I'm a huge fan of with Casey Liz, that the gestation of this idea sort of was taken up when this kind of Serial exploded and you saw the storytelling component of things go so great. What was it that made you choose this particular subject for your first entree into this area?
So I have a list of different subjects that I would like to cover. The hope will be that we will do more of these seasons in the future. So this will be a thing with Inquisitive, that we will do these seasons where they're more in depth and they're more story based. But we're still working out what the future is going to be of that. But that's the hope. And then one of them, and it was the first one that I thought of really, was to look at app development. And part of it was logistical. I needed to make sure that I could create the best sounding, the best produced show that I could make with interesting people. And over the time I've been doing these interviews, iOS app developers have been a big core of the people that I've spoken to, and people that have become friends and peers. So I believed that I would be able to create the best possible show I could whilst looking at this subject. And also, we're trying to build an audience for the show. We're trying to bring new people to Inquisitive, new people to Relay FM. So what I thought I would start with was something that was accessible to the existing audience that we have. So iOS app development in the tech space makes a lot of sense, but I have other topics that I want to cover which are not necessarily as heavy tech focused, maybe a bit more culture-y, or just slightly different. But I thought, to get our foot in the door and to show people this is what we can do, I wanted something that I could make that I'd be happy with and that I was really interested in, and also something that I felt would appeal to the audience that we'd built over time.
And one thing that I thought of as well is that actually, I think this is a broader based appealed subject, even with those goals for the other topics. There are so many smartphones, and everybody uses apps. By and large, even if you aren't one who buys apps or goes out into the stores, there's a bunch of apps on your phone. And so if this show, I think, could get out to those even maybe beyond kind of the mainstream Relay FM audience, I think a lot of people would find this very interesting because everybody uses apps.
I completely agree. And we have actually, I have thought of this in the way that we position the show. So I try not to go too in-depth into really kind of super nerdy inside baseball type things. I try and steer away from those where possible. And if there is a story, like for example, we told a really interesting story with Guy English about the creation of a company called Tapulous, who ported jailbroken iOS apps over to the App Store when it launched. And I've really wanted to include that story. So whenever we do include things like that, I make sure that I explain it, without being too patronizing. I just try and explain it to people in terms that make sense, very briefly. Very briefly, so it allows them to latch onto it, to get a bit of context and to understand. But I try and do that without, alienating either the existing audience that do know or the new audience that don't.
And I think a lot of those who aren't familiar with this type of story have no concept or idea what this industry is like, what the work that goes into some of these applications behind when you talk about years of development and hours invested in releasing a great product. So many people, I imagine, some of my family and friends, just look at them as little colored icons on their phone, and they have no concept. And I think this show is really shedding a light on that and going to bring a huge new respect for those who have no idea.
I hope so. Like the episodes that I'm working on right now are like where the ideas come from, how the ideas become apps. That's kind of what I'm working on at the moment. And then after that, I'm going to be doing a couple of stories, and I'm actually it's some spoilers. So I have a friend of mine who's getting ready to release an iOS app, like within the next couple of weeks that he's been working on. And one of the episodes that I wanted to do for the show is what it's like the day before launch. And I've spoken to a couple of developers and kind of got their opinions. How does it feel before you launch an iOS app? But I'm actually going to be talking to my friend on the night before he releases his app to the world. And I think that it will be a nice kind of contrast, and I'm trying to, as the show's going on, to bring more different voices in, and I think that there's going to be some interesting stories that come out of that as well.
Here's a strange angle, Myke. Do you think your work with the show, and I want to talk more about kind of all that's gone into moving this direction with Inquisitive, but I just had this thought when you mentioned the person who is about to launch an app the night before, and you'll be having that conversation. Do you think there's some parallels in sort of your assembly of the new Inquisitive? I know on Analog you've talked about what that's felt like, and folks, that's another show you really need to be subscribing to, Analog from Relay FM. But do you think that there's some parallel feeling? Do you think like your sympathy have kind of increased for those folks given your experience now?
I would say, like, for one, developing an iOS app is way more complex than what I'm doing. But I understand your question, and I would say that I probably agree, and I hadn't thought of it that way, but this is definitely more of an assembly than the other shows that I do. All of the other shows, the kind of the weekly topical episodic shows, you prepare for a couple of days and do the show, edit the show, put it out. But this thing, this one I'm doing with Inquisitive, it was months of work before anybody saw it, and then it's continuing to need refinement as it goes. So it's kind of, you're right, it is more akin to that, to the story that I'm telling with people than I'd maybe kind of allowed for, which is quite interesting. But this is, as far as projects go, this is the biggest undertaking that I had, and it's hard work, but so far it's been rewarding and on the whole very enjoyable.
So when we talk about the process that you went through to put this together, talk to us a little bit about the time, the effort, sort of how many interviews have you done so far? Give us kind of a portrait of the landscape of what all went into this.
So I think I've done about 6 interviews. I've spoken to about 6 or 7 different people on the whole, and each of those were about 2 hours. I've done a couple of other smaller ones here and there. But the bulk of the interviews were about 2 hours. They're the voices that you hear kind of every episode, and that's about half of the topics covered. So I'm currently in the stage now of getting towards the end of those topics, because I'm producing episodes in advance. So I'm working on. We've just released episode 3 last week. We've got episode 4 coming out this week, and I'm working on currently episode 6 and 7. So I'm trying to give myself a bit of a buffer with the show. But once I've completed maybe episode 7 or episode 8. I will need to re-interview everybody or conduct new interviews, and I'm booking a bunch of those in now with people. So that's that part. And then I guess I think the hardest thing for me is the script writing. So we have scripts for each episode, which is the main bulk of a voiceover that I record, which tells the main part of the story, which tries to establish the narrative of the story. That's the bit that I find the hardest. It's the bit that I have the most help in. I have a good friend of mine, Marco Savage. He gets credited at the end of every episode as our editorial advisor. Basically, Marco he reads my scripts, tells me where they're rubbish, suggests some things to improve them, and then once we've got that to a point that we're happy, I record the voiceover. Then I start going through the what I've recorded. So I go through the interviews and pull out the clips that are necessary for that episode, and I then start assembling it like a big jigsaw. So I have all of my component parts. I have my voiceover and I have my clips, and I start putting them together, and I record additional voiceover for each episode to kind of introduce and frame the clips. And sometimes after I pulled the clips out, it gives more of a narrative. So it's kind of like a growing process as it goes along. At the moment, if I can remain properly focused on it, it takes me about a week to make an episode. So the script writing is a all-day process, even in the first draft for me, because it's something that I find the most difficult with the whole thing. The clip cutting can take a couple of hours, and then the editing can take maybe 5 or 6 hours. Then once I've got the first draft done of the show, I send that to a few people. The producers that you hear are credited at the end of each week. They get to hear it. They suggest their refinements. I make those refinements, and then the episode is done until the morning of the release of the episode. I listen through again to the whole thing. I construct the show notes and make any final tweaks or adjustments, because one of the things that I've noticed is, as the show's gone on, and you'll probably hear it, my style of the way that I present the show is changing as I'm becoming more comfortable and more practiced. And as I go through and do that final listen through, I spot some things that I tweak that I've learned along the way. Like, for example, once I got to episode 1, I'd already started working on episode 3, and then when I listened back, I was like, oh, I'd like the music to be bedded longer now, because previously the music would just cut in, but now I have it kind of fade in a little bit more, and that's like some stylistic changes that I've made. And the way that I present the show, the way that I speak, the way that I read is changing, and I make sort of shifts like that. So it's a long process. It's a very long process.
And I think in some of your other shows, I've heard you mention this process began somewhere around November or so. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
And now that you're, I guess that's, what is that, about 5 months in or so, and you are working, you mentioned episode 6 and 7 and beyond, and you talked about how you've kind of evolved your thought process. I've talked to a few other podcasters as well, and some of my recommendations that are trying to do or are doing something similar, and they all talk about the work and the effort and so on and so forth. If somebody out there is hearing this right now and they're a big fan of technology or storytelling, kind of this combination that the new Inquisitive is, based on what you've learned so far, Myke, what would you tell somebody who says, I want to try to give this a shot?
Start small. So there's a guy that I've been talking to. He's just posted the first episode of a show called Welcome to Macintosh. It's a guy named Mark Bramhill. And he's doing like a storytelling show in that guise, and he's like kind of in the same vein. He's like breaking his back to create the best show that he can. But what Mark's doing is he's got like fortnightly episodes, and that allows him more time to construct the show, right? So that's one way to help you do it. But I think that I don't think that all podcasting needs to be like this. And personally, I prefer the style of the other shows that I do, which is unscripted, but prepared and people talking. Shows like the Accidental Tech Podcast and shows that we do like Connected and Upgrade on Relay, which is they're prepared and people are informed, but it's not scripted and it's not heavily edited, and there's not months and weeks of work going in to every single episode, because as I mentioned before, they're like topical episodic shows that require a couple of days research in advance at most. I don't know if everybody needs to create the heavily produced NPR style stuff, but it is a style that I wanted Relay to have a hand in. Basically, Dan, for me, this was I want to prove that we can do this, and I want to show that we can do this, and we don't need to have a staff of 20 to do it, because I believe that we can, and I think that we are. And I don't think that Inquisitive, I mean, I'm not trying to inflate my own ego. I don't think Inquisitive is anywhere near in production to something like Serial or a lot of the NPR stuff, or even some of the Gimlet stuff as well. They're doing incredible things, and their production levels are higher, and that's fine for me, because I think that what we're doing is, I'm really proud of it, considering it's majorly one person working on it. But I think that if you want to make a podcast and you want it to be this way, and it's going to take you a week to produce each episode, I think you should go for it. Remember, I'm running a business and have other shows and stuff, but if you just want to have a hobby and you want your hobby to be a show that's like this, then it will fill a couple of nights a week for you, and that, I think that's perfectly fine. Or you can have a show where it fills a couple of hours a week for you, because it's easier to produce. I don't think that the work should necessarily turn people off. You just need to appreciate that if you really want it to be good and sound good, it just takes more work than the average show.
And for those other shows, you mentioned some of the other shows that you guys have on Relay FM, and I want to temporarily detour and talk about a couple of those. I don't know in your mind, or if you've ever verbalized this, because I don't know that I've heard it, but I can tell you as a listener to 75% of the Relay shows, I subscribe to the master feed, and the one that I would consider, and maybe this perspective is unique to you, as sort of Relay's flagship, is Connected, in my mind. Because one, your co-founder, Stephen Hackett's, joins you on that show, as well as Federico Vitici, who's obviously, especially lately, been getting a lot of attention in the Apple blogger space, if you will. Wonderful work over at Mac Stories. But Connected's had sort of a long tail. It's been around a while in a couple incarnations. Anyone who's not checked that show out, can you tell them a little bit about what they'll find there?
Flagship's interesting. I think it definitely was the case when we launched the network. I don't know. Now it's like I don't know if we have a flagship show. I guess for me, we're trying to make Inquisitive that right now. I think it changes depending on where the focus is. But when we launched, 100%. Connected was the flagship, and it probably to many people will still be that way, and it's interesting, the way you mention it, because the people that are maybe the most heavily involved in the network are on that show. I mean, what changes is that we have Jason now. Jason's also a really big name, and he has a couple of shows on the network as well. But I totally understand what you're saying. Connected is very interesting, because you will I think many people that are listening to this will maybe be used to a few guys talking about tech with a focus on Apple. But I think Connected is different, because we're three people with very, very unique views on technology and the way that we approach things, especially with the way that we look at our Apple devices. I feel that many shows that we listen to, there are people that are coming from similar backgrounds, which is perfectly fine, and it makes for a very interesting conversation. But one of the things that you find on Connected, and it's one of the things that we're so proud of, is there are three people that come from extremely different backgrounds, from very different parts of the world, and they use their computing devices in very, very different ways for very, very different results. And what that actually ends up in is, for quite frequently, very, very spirited and heated debate, which I feel like in a lot of shows you don't hear that as much as you do on our show. Like, quite frequently on Connected, you will hear one of us actually shouting at another one. And I love that about the show, and I think our best episodes are where we don't agree with each other, and we're fuming mad at each other for 15 minutes because someone won't understand how files work on iOS because they fundamentally see it as a different psychological thing. And I think it makes the show very different, and I think it makes it a very interesting listen if you're interested in that stuff.
I absolutely am, and it is one of my favorite technology shows, and you mentioned the different backgrounds, and for folks, if you are interested in technology or you've not ever checked this show out, let me give you a parallel just from my own personal opinion again on Connected, and then we'll move on and talk about a few other things. But Connected is sort of like your... Myke, you mentioned that there are a lot of technology shows with guys sitting around talking. There are a lot of sitcoms on television. But one of the things that maybe might make a sitcom appeal to somebody is the actors or the cast, because they really enjoy those actors or the cast and how they interact and how they work together. And you guys, as if you will, and I mean this with the utmost respect, as a cast of characters, are so wonderful to listen to. Like you said, all those different perspectives, the arguments back and forth, and it creates at the end a product that is amazing. And you guys have done so many different things with that show in terms of going over a lot of the keynote announcements and kind of replaying them. And I could go on for a while about Connected, but I just wanted to get your thoughts on it a little bit because I think it's a wonderful Relay FM show.
Thank you, Dan. I appreciate that. It is interesting because we do a lot of things on that show that bleed out to other shows, and I think if you were going to call it the flagship, that would probably be why. We've trialed a lot of interesting and different things on Connected that then spin out and become their own thing. So, like for example, the video game show that me and Federico have, Virtual, came as part of the end of an episode of Connected once where Stephen was away and me and him were just talking about how much we love video games. So we started a video game podcast. And then you mentioned like the keynote announcements where we went back and broke down the episode, the original iPhone, the original iPad, and then also the history of the iPod and the iPod keynotes. And they're really heavily produced with lots of audio clips and a lot of research, and a lot of the skills that I learned doing those episodes helped with the creation and the continued development of Inquisitive. Yeah, it definitely is like a proving ground for the fun ideas that we have, and I think it's because the three of us together, we feed off each other and very creative.
And I would argue, Myke, that what you and Stephen have done with Relay, as you look at sort of each of the shows, there is something about each one of them that is unique and different. We've mentioned in Inquisitive, we've talked about what you're producing there, which I think is the first of its kind, especially in the technology-related area, but also with Analog. And I remember when you and Casey started that show, it was one of these, how is this going to come off type deals. And it has immediately moved to the top of one of my subscription lists. I love that show. That's kind of like where everything else goes and how we feel about it. Is that?
Well, yeah, and as well, like you're saying about the different flair, like we're very particular about what we want to be on our network, and we don't have like a guide. It's just kind of like we'll know it when we hear it. And like if you look at, so we have a selection of technology shows, right? So if you look at our crop, we have Upgrade, Connected, and Clockwise. And we also have Rocket as well, yeah, so let's count Rocket in that as well. So let's say like we have Connected, Clockwise, Upgrade, and Rocket. They're all they are tech-focused, heavily Apple-based. Clockwise is 30 minutes long, 4 topics, 4 guests, and it has a really interesting format. It's snappy, you can listen to it on your lunch break. Like you have Connected, where it's 3 guys and we talk about like our lives and the personal things and the way that technology affects us personally, and as you say, it's like a cast of characters having fun, and it's got a very different vibe. And then you have Rocket, where it's 3 female hosts, which is very rare for the tech space, and some of the tangents they go on Rocket are fantastic, and it's stuff that you won't hear anywhere else because their viewpoint is so different to other tech shows because they tend to be all men, and we're honored to have Rocket as part of Relay FM. And then you have Upgrade, and Upgrade with Jason, I get the pleasure, and we all get the pleasure, I think, of hearing his opinions about this stuff in long form every week. And me and him are really trying to experiment with that show. We talk a lot about being creative, and we talk a lot about like being an independent creator, as well as talking about like what's happening in the Apple space and what's happening with Microsoft and stuff like that. So even though those shows they share a common topic, they are formatted so differently that you could listen to all 4 of them, I think, and get enjoyment out of them.
I think so as well, and I do, and a lot of the relay shows sort of do hit that their own flavor, and I think they're all different and unique in their own way. You mentioned Rocket, we talked about Jason and Upgrade, and it is something you can't find anywhere else in the tech space. But that experience, and you're on many of those shows that we've just talked about, in putting together those shows, releasing them, and seeing the reaction and the reception. Contrast that for me with so far in the life of the new Inquisitive. How's it been for you personally as a feeling of satisfaction?
Inquisitive has been an incredibly emotional ride so far. So, I worked really, really hard on it, got really great feedback, personally and privately, put the show out there, got incredible feedback. It had a really great reception. Lots of people linked to it, and it had, the numbers kind of went through the roof, as these things do, and then it kind of like took most shows I have found when you put them out like this, it's like anything, you get your spike, and then you get people that stick around, you get people that are just coming in to check it out, and we stabilized a good number. Basically, I had a target that I needed for us to hit. I thought to make it worthwhile, from a time perspective and financially, and we're like at that right now, which is really great, because I thought that it would take longer to hit that. I thought we'd have to go a few weeks, but from like episode 2 and episode 3 and stuff like that, we're at that. We're at that range now, which is fantastic. So that's really great. But I was really worried about that, so I was really nervous and anxious about it, and very concerned that we weren't going to hit it, and it was going to feel like it was a waste of my time, to put all that effort in. It's been really interesting because the amount of positive feedback that I've had has been much, much higher than anything else that I've done, which is good because I feel like that equates to the additional work that was put in. You put a lot in, and I've got a lot out of it.
And so you mentioned that there's the reception has been great, but one thing I'd like to know about little analog kind of style, though, is how about for you personally, though, Myke? I mean, I know from listening to you for a long time, you're your own worst critic. How have you been satisfied so far with what's been out there? And I think by the time folks are listening to this, I think 4 will have been released. So far, are you personally satisfied with what's been out there?
It's my best work. Without a shadow of a doubt, this is the best thing I've ever made, and I'm very, very proud of it. And I wouldn't, currently as it stands, I won't release an episode now unless I'm proud of it. I've took my first draft at the script of episode 6 and 7, and it's not good. I've not landed on what I want to say, and the topic, and the way that I've written it has been good. I didn't feel that when I was kind of sharing it around for drafts, and the feedback that I've gotten has been the same, so I'm kind of going to go back to the drawing board on it, which sucks because it's more work, but I am not willing right now to put out an episode that's just good enough, because I'm extremely proud of what I've made, and this isn't, usually I struggle to be like brash about these types of things and to be like arrogant or whatever, but I like to be humble and just be a little bit modest, because it's just the way that I'm most comfortable to be. But I think that what I've made is really good, and when I listen back, I'm extremely proud of myself. So maybe for once, I'm gonna let go of that and just be honest about it, and that's genuinely how I feel, Dan. Like I feel like I've made something that I'm really proud of, and that shows what I'm capable of, and I think that people like it. If they don't like it, or if it doesn't fit for them, that's fine, because at least at the end of the day, I've done my best. But that does, at the same side, like if the show ends up failing, right, it's gonna suck and it's gonna hurt more, because it's like, well, I don't feel like I could have done any more than this. But it's been a wild ride so far, and I have to say that I've got a lot invested emotionally in this show because of the amount of time and effort and the amount that I'm weighing on it. But I am happy. I am happy with it.
When, from a context of your podcasting career, which has been a fairly long one for those who don't know, if anyone's...
5 years in April. I'm actually today, as we're recording, it's 4 years. No, it's 4 years and 11 months. So April 10th is going to be 5 years.
Throughout that time, you've started networks, you've hosted a bunch of shows with all kinds of wonderful people, you've been a part of other networks, and so on and so forth. Now, you mentioned that your favorite type of show still is kind of the discussion or interview type shows, a lot of what else is on Relay FM, but that this one ends up being your best work. As you continue through this career and looking back kind of at all your different stops and shows, is there a part of you that might think that you are finally achieving a sense of satisfaction and accomplishment that maybe you've been looking for all along?
That's a great question. I've always been happy with the work that I've done. And part of this comes from that I have a real sense that if I'm not happy with something anymore, I either change it or kill it. And anybody that's followed my career has seen the amount of projects and stuff that I've started and run for a year or 6 months and then they end, because that's the way that I feel. If I'm not enthused anymore, if I feel like it's not as good as it could be, and that we tried and we just can't get it back to where we want it to be, then I am happy to let things go like that. So I think to a point I've definitely always been happy with the work that I've done, but right now, because I could only do this. I can only make this show because I am a full-time independent podcaster. That is what I do for a living. I make this stuff for a living. I don't do anything else. I don't do any freelancing, any consulting, or anything. My entire living is provided by Relay FM and the shows that we make. So that is an incredible accomplishment for me because that was my dream. So I can only create a show like Inquisitive because I have worked so hard and have been able to achieve my goal. So it kind of fits that this would be the thing that I've always worked to do, because this show is the result of me having the time to put this amount of effort and work in, and I only have that time because this is what I do for a living. So I guess in a way, yeah, it does build to that.
And let me ask you, you alluded to Relay FM being that soul, and I know from following you all along this process or that you went through to ultimately become a full-time podcaster. A lot of my audience, because I review and recommend shows, are other podcasters. I don't know if it's even fair to ask what one thing, but can you kind of let folks know what that's been like? Do you have any regrets about doing it? Was it a good decision? Would you encourage others to do it?
I think podcasting is amazing. I think that it is a form of art that allows you to be extremely expressive. You can cover anything you want. The niches that you can go in. We have a show about pens. Like, it's something that I love. It's something that my co-host Brad Dowdy loves, and we get to talk about it to an audience that share along with it with us, and the connection that you can have with podcasts and the podcast audiences is just incredible, and it's like nothing else. Like I know so many people that write for a living. They write independently, and they say that their podcast audiences are just so much more engaged and so much more giving and sharing with them. So the people that you end up creating a community with make it worth it. But just the hobby of being able to talk about the thing that you love and effuse about it for an hour is just that is what makes it so fantastic. I would encourage anyone to start their own podcast. I wouldn't encourage anybody to consider it to be their future living, like when they're starting out, because it's like anything. Podcasting is a form of entertainment, and getting into any form of entertainment and being successful enough that you will be able to make a living out of it is incredibly difficult to do, because there's always too many people making for the amount of people that can make a living. And I've been very lucky and very fortunate to just go on a path that has taken me to where I am today. It's not a path that's going to be available for everyone, but it will be available for the people that want to work hard enough, because I think that's what it takes. You just need to have the want and the desire to make it, and if you do, you'll make it. But not everybody has it, and not everybody should have it, because for so many people, other things will take priority. So, like for me personally, I had to sacrifice an incredible amount that I don't think everybody should. Like, for the past 5 years, like I basically haven't had that much of a social life, because I have decided that I will devote my evenings and my weekends to podcasting because that's what I wanted to do. But I don't think everybody should do that. That's crazy. Like, that's not something that people should decide to do. So I don't think that, this is something that you have to think that way. But if it is what you want to do, you can do it. And the great thing about it is there's nobody to stop you. Like, unlike many other forms of entertainment, like, there is nobody regulating this. There is no big player that is controlling it. Like, you could just go and do it, and you can talk about anything. And I guarantee you, no matter whatever crazy thing you love, there will be other people that will find you because they love it too. And that's what makes podcasting so incredible.
And it's something like, I was thinking when you were describing that, Myke, it's you mentioned other forms of entertainment, and I would say athletics as well. Athletes are actors. You've got to go through the minor leagues. You've got to put in the hours. You've got to have the repetition. You've got to get the right equipment. And if you're willing to travel that road, ultimately, pay your dues, if you will, you may be able to get to the point where it could be a full-time deal. But if not, as in a lot of those other areas, folks drop off and they're not up to muster to make it to that level. Is that a fair analogy, you think?
I think so. I think so. It is like anything. Like, you got to put the time in. You've got to put the effort in, and you've got to be prepared to make the sacrifices and stuff. And again, you kind of have to pay your dues and stuff like that. So you can get there. You can do it. Anybody can, but you got to just push for it. There isn't like you're not born with it. You're not born with the ability to be a podcaster.
Yeah, I completely agree. I'm also a mobile DJ, and I see a lot of people in that industry that really shouldn't be doing it, and but people try, and sometimes the time and the response from folks will weed out those who necessarily shouldn't be in it.
Yep.
Let me ask you, Inquisitive is obviously, I would consider, a career marker, if you will. I know right around the turn of the year on Analog, you guys talked about goals a lot in what's coming forward. If we can, for a second, assume that Inquisitive has been a success. You mentioned other topics and other incarnations and getting help and moving forward and so on and so forth. Beyond the reformatted and new efforts of Inquisitive, what's the future for Myke Hurley or Relay FM? What's kind of that next mountain you're looking to tackle?
The interesting thing is we've achieved a lot of our short-term goals, and now, like, I think that there isn't something that is specific that we're really, really focusing on. Inquisitive was for me and for us the next big thing that we had to do, and right now, at least off the top of my head, I can't think of the big next thing that we're trying to accomplish. So I think it's kind of right now we are in a process of refining and reforming. So we are building our business. And there's a lot of work that needs to go into that behind the scenes. I think probably the one kind of hopefully not long-term goal that we have is that, we would love Stephen to be able to be supported fully by the business as well. So we can both go and just focus on this and make Relay even better and even stronger. So, that kind of stuff, that comes from building the network, building the audience, building the sponsorship, and generally just like building Relay FM LLC as a business. And that's something that, luckily, we are growing that constantly. And we're working with some great sponsors, some great partners, and that stuff is going really, really well for us. So I think we need to continue doing that. I would like to see the network grow a little. We have no intention of you turning up to Relay FM in 6 months and there'd be 25 shows there. That is not a focus. Like, the focus is we add what we think is right at the right time. And we're working on some stuff. We have some things that we're working on right now, which are exciting, but it's not a lot. And I think that we're gonna continue trying to keep that way for a while, because I genuinely want people to come to Relay.fm and they will be able to find a selection of shows that are unique. They have something fun about them, and they have just the thing that you like to listen to them for. And I want us to stay that way. So that's kind of like, at least for the foreseeable future, that's kind of where we're focused.
I got one more question for you, Myke, and then I'll let you go. In terms of, because it just popped into my head when you mentioned sponsorships, it's one of the things that I wondered about, and I haven't heard you talk about yet. Obviously, sponsorships are a big part of Relay FM and your living, and I've heard your talks about that before. But in the new Inquisitive, have you had any thoughts about how that were to best fit? I'm kind of wondering if there was an internal conversation that you and Steven had maybe on how to make that work with the new Inquisitive.
We found a couple of sponsors that were willing to take a bit of blind faith with us. Cards Against Humanity is one, and Campaign Monitor is another. And those companies, I pitched the idea to them, told them how much I wanted because I thought how many downloads we'd have, and they said yes. And kind of then I spoke to those companies and asked them what they wanted to do. And Campaign Monitor loved the way that I talk about their product, so they wanted me to continue doing that. And Cards Against Humanity wanted to try something a little bit more artistic, so they're interviewing game developers because they have a great connection with the game development community, naturally. And they're interviewing iOS game developers, and we put a great little 60 to 90 second interview in the shows. I don't know what the answer is. I think that the way that we currently do a lot of our advertising makes sense. And to a point, I think that it's a case of us working with the advertisers to make something that we think sounds good for the shows and they think does the best job of selling their products. I think that is important. I think it's important that I feel that we don't let editorial mess up the advertising message and vice versa. So like the stories that Cards Against Humanity are telling have got nothing to do with Cards Against Humanity. There are stories that they're telling that they think are interesting. They don't even mention Cards Against Humanity in their ads. I have to do that for them because I think it's just something that they're not interested in. They're like a patron of the arts. And so, I'm not passing judgment on anybody else. I'm just not sure if anybody has completely cracked it about the way to do this stuff. But I think the way that we currently do a lot of our sponsors works. And I'm just trying to find a way to make a lot of that best fit with this new format, at least for now. And maybe in the future we try it out again. But right now we're not sure what happens at the end of the Behind the App series. So I'm not in the habit right now of making any really sweeping changes to the way that our business works. Right,
and that was what I was getting at with the Cards Against Humanity, with those interviews. I think they fit great, and because they're game developers, there's sort of that relevance, to the actual episodes. And I was wondering if that was sort of an intention and an idea on something that might fit better than the quote ad break that is sort of typical.
Yeah, I mean, I understand both sides of it. Like, I see why if you're doing a story-driven show, there should be stories as the ads. I get that, but then at the same time, I also see the other part of it where it's like if you then end up telling 3 different stories about sponsors and you're trying to tell another story, it might get a bit muddled. So that's why you hear on the show experimentation. Like, we're trying it out and we're seeing what fits. And right now, I think that they're balanced quite nicely. And we're just trying to work out what the best thing is. I mean, I'm getting feedback on both sides from people. Some people hate it, some people love it, some people think we should do this thing, some people think we should do the exact opposite. I don't know. I don't know what we're going to do, but I think it's interesting to try it all out.
I think so too, and those Cards Against Humanity guys are the ones to do it with, I think. Aren't those the guys that send John Syracuse with the toasters?
Yeah. This is what I love. I love all of our sponsors, but Cards Against Humanity are doing things differently because they have, for whatever reason, they don't require you to talk about their actual product. Like, they are sponsoring you as Cards Against Humanity, the company, not Cards Against Humanity, the game, and it's very different, and which is why I kind of refer to them as like a patron of the arts. Max Temkin loves this stuff, and they're a great supporter, and that's kind of the route that they're taking, and for them, what they're clearly, I think, attempting is brand advertisement, where a lot of the other sponsors want product advertisement, and I think as we move down this road, there will be more brand advertising, which will take this like different track to it, to then rather than the product-led advertising. But I think we're still a couple of years away from that. But what Cards Against Humanity are doing is kind of pioneering the way that some of that sort of stuff's going to look. I think that we will see in the future companies, like look at MailChimp, right? With what they were doing with cereal, that's brand advertising. They were just putting their name out and attaching it to the thing that they know people love. And I think we're going to start to see a lot more of that, but I think that we're far off from that. Squarespace is another one. Squarespace are product-driven, but they have a blanket approach to their advertising. So they sponsor a lot of stuff. It's the joke, right? They sponsor an incredible amount of shows because that is them advertising their brand. But they believe, I feel, that their brand is strongest in their product. And they talk about that. And that's what they ask us to talk about. But they do really, really wide messaging. We had, I'm just going off on a tangent now, like at Christmas, Igloo allowed us and wanted us to create a Christmas carol called White Igloo, which we played in a bunch of our shows. Again, they're experimenting with something. We didn't even really talk about the product. We kind of made a fun poke at the product in a nice way by using their slogans as parts of the song. And, so I think what we're starting to see is very different types of advertising. And I think that is incredibly healthy for the medium.
I think so too. And I think that the more that it can kind of, be almost additional entertainment for the listener, I think will be the better reception, especially from that brand concept, like you mentioned, MailChimp with cereal. I mean, geez, I think everybody knew that commercial, or at least had all the bad pronunciations down by the time cereal became huge. And I'm just hoping Cards Against Humanity maybe starts sending you more American foods to sample.
I'm worried that they're going to do that. I'm concerned that sort of stuff's going to start happening, and we'll see.
It's en route. I think you're going to start getting American foods to review. Well, Myke, I really appreciate the time. And before we go, can you let everyone know where they can find the new show Inquisitive, as well as all the Relay FM stuff?
So you go to relay.fm, you'll find all our shows there. Inquisitive is at relay.fm/inquisitive. And if you want to start with the first in the Behind the App series, episode 27 of Inquisitive was Behind the App number 1. But once you go to the website, once you go to relay.fm/inquisitive, it will become apparent where you need to go, because the shows are all named quite nicely, I think. It makes it obvious when you're looking at it.
And folks, I highly recommend Inquisitive starting at that episode 27. I mean, really, I think all the episodes, the previous interview styles were excellent as well. But if you want to sort of find something that you can share with anyone you know who uses a mobile app, Inquisitive starting at episode 27 with the Behind the App series is an excellent place to do that. Myke Hurley, you're doing excellent work over there. I'm a huge fan, and I can't thank you enough for taking the time to join me today.
Absolute pleasure, sir. Thank you.
Folks, that'll do it for this week for the Podcast Digest. Until next week, my name's Dan Lizette. Have a great week.
Thank you for listening to the Podcast Digest. You can follow the show on Twitter at PodDigest. Like the show on Facebook at facebook.com/The Podcast Digest. Email the show feedback at thepodcastdigest@gmail.com. And you can find all the previous episodes and exclusive blog entries at the show's website, thepodcastdigest.info.